will you release those transcripts so the American people can review them, your own transcripts?
I'd have no objection to that, and we're discussing that with White House counsel as we speak. But when people see the transcripts of my calls and when they hear the reporting of our conversation, President Trump's focus with Ukraine from the very beginning was on enlisting more European support and supporting President Zelensky's efforts to advance reforms that would end an era of corruption in Ukraine.
That's Vice President Mike Pence speaking to reporters in Iowa about 3 weeks ago about his call with Ukraine's President Zelensky. Joining us now, NBC News correspondent Carol Lee. She's here with her latest reporting on the internal White House debate that is stifling the release of the Pence-Zelensky call. Carol, good morning. So we heard Vice President Pence right there say he'd have no problem putting that out to the public. He has nothing to hide. So the question is, why haven't we seen that transcript?
That's a great question. And basically, that was almost 3 weeks ago. It'll be 3 weeks ago tomorrow, where the vice president said that. And since then, we've learned that there's been this internal debate, this back and forth about whether or not it's wise to release the transcript of his call. And there's a camp that's against it. And their arguments are, there's many of them. One is that, the more you release, the more momentum that it gives impeachment. More transcripts means more requests for other transcripts potentially. There's a precedent argument. And then there's the concern that if you were to stack up the vice president's call with Zelensky and the president's call with Zelensky, that it wouldn't really make the president look very good, that potentially it's, not going to be the perfect call that the president said his call was, and that's concerning. Now, there are those who are for this who say that, look, we don't have a lot of ways to fight back. There's this deluge of testimony that's damaging coming from the Hill, and this could be one of the ways in which we could push back by showing that there was no there in the vice president's call. And then there are people around the vice president who think that this is a way to clear his name. There's some increasing concern that this is going to somehow tarnish him. And as you saw, he does not really answer directly what his knowledge was about this, about the pressure campaign on Ukraine. And so there's worry there. But we spoke to an administration official who said that they're still reviewing this. And I think, Willie, that really underscores how much this White House still hasn't gotten its act together in terms of getting on the same page and coming up with a plan to push back on impeachment.
And as you say, the release of the president's phone call summary, that didn't go quite the way they planned, didn't have the effect they thought it was going to have. So they don't want another one out there. But you got to something else I wanted to ask you about, which is Mike Pence out publicly. We saw it in that clip, shows no daylight with the president. He stands by the president. But is there some instinct with him and the team around him? He's a longtime politician. He's not a dumb guy. He knows what he's doing. To begin to preserve himself and to preserve his own legacy, if that can be done at this point. He sees the writing on the wall. He's going to see this new testimony from Colonel Vindman today. Is he working behind the scenes to save himself?
Well, we know that people who are allies of the vice president are a little, worried that he's not going to come out of this squeaky clean. And that's because, there's one of two options. Either he was aware that all of this stuff was going on and he didn't say anything or do anything about it, or he was actually a participant in some of it. And neither of those things are good and for the vice president. And he also has his own political ambitions. This is someone who, it's well known that he thinks that he might run for president someday. This is not his last stop on the campaign trail, being vice president. And so, yet at the same time, he is one of President Trump's staunchest defenders. But if you look at what he's saying, he's not actually defending the substance. He's asked about, did the president, was there a transcript, was there a pressure, did you see any pressure from the president to investigate his political allies? And his response is things like, well, I never mentioned the Bidens to President Zelensky of Ukraine. So it's a very careful kind of balance there.
Carol, speaking of careful balance, everybody is aware that all of the release of the transcripts that we're talking about here is self-induced, brought on by the behavior of the Trump administration, specifically the president himself. But long range, looking down the road, the release of transcripts between presidents and vice presidents with other foreign leaders is kind of troubling.
Yeah, there's a real concern particularly among lawyers about the precedent that this sets, because these are conversations that are supposed to be had in private. They're not out there for the public. There's a reason for that. There's a belief that, world leaders should be able to have open conversations without it spilling out into public view. There's also, if you're president and you're talking to another world leader, what if they're worried that you're going to release the transcripts like we learned that the Ukrainians were? The other thing that people raise concerns about is that if you release, the more you put out there, like transcripts of phone calls like this, that it waters down your ability to exert executive privilege, because the more that you disclose, then the argument is, well, if you're put this out there, then why can't we get more? And so it's a concern and it was one of the reasons why there were a lot of people who were against President Trump releasing the transcript of his call initially.
James Fallows, you and your wife, Deborah, of course, are doing what I want to do when I grow up. You are flying across America, going from small town to small town, and you've always had a very optimistic view of America, because you've been able to see a patchwork of communities from east to west. I'm curious, just big picture, is this resonating yet with our towns? Is this resonating yet in Middle America? Are they still looking at this as some sort of intramural squabble in Washington?
So we just spent the past week in Central Oregon doing a film project there, and people are aware of this struggle going on in D.C. But again, it was interesting, as we found over the years, that it wasn't something people volunteered in talking about the business base of the town, how they're managing growth, how they're managing homelessness and opioids and things of that sort. So I think it is in background consciousness, but it's not something that people are volunteering to talk about. And you can view that as good in sort of the resilience of American fabric. You can view it as, for the Democrats, troubling, and that people are not really up on sort of the accumulation of evidence. I suspect that when this comes to more of a head with a formal vote, formal hearings, it's why the Democrats would need to lay out more of their case, I believe.
Well, and forgive me for asking you to speculate here, but we all respect your opinion so much. I'm curious where you think this may be going. Where do you see this going over the next month or two?
I've learned to have two different strands of predictions in my brain. One is what would happen under normal sort of rules of gravity and rules of physics, and the other is what we've learned about over the last 3 or 4 years. You would think that with so many different strands gaining momentum and gaining connection, and with such apparent lack of sophistication and being able to rebut them, and with such intramural tension within the administration, that sooner rather than later you'd reach that tipping point where the Republican senators in particular start to say, oh, I'm shocked, just shocked to find that there's corruption going on here. So that seems that the rules of normal physics would predict that for you in the next couple of months. The rules of our actual known world, God knows.
James Fallows, thank you. NBC's Carol Lee, thank you as well for your reporting this morning. And coming up, President Trump made his first visit to Chicago yesterday, and he came with insults, of course. While speaking to a conference of police chiefs, he called the city an embarrassment. That moment is ahead on Morning Joe.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.